The fluorescent lights of the Pentagon's East Entrance checkpoint hummed with institutional indifference as Marine Lance Corporal Derek Hastings positioned himself beside the metal detector, his pressed uniform bearing the sharp creases of a man who believed protocol was religion. Beyond the bulletproof glass, Washington's autumn morning scattered golden leaves across the plaza, but inside these walls, only rank and regulation mattered. Hastings had worked this checkpoint for 8 months, long enough to develop an instinct for the subtle hierarchies that governed this building, the confident stride of four-star generals, the hurried efficiency of senior aides, the careful deference of visiting dignitaries. He prided himself on reading people before they reached his station, on knowing who deserved his crispest salute and who required only perfunctory courtesy. The woman approaching now registered somewhere in the middle of his internal calculus. Mid-40s, perhaps 50, with silver threading through dark hair pulled into a regulation bun. She wore a simple navy blazer over khaki slacks, carried a worn leather briefcase that had seen better decades, and moved with the kind of quiet economy that spoke of someone comfortable in their own skin but uninterested in making impressions. No uniform, no visible insignia, nothing that screamed importance. Hastings had processed 1,000 similar Pentagon staffers, mid-level analysts, logistics coordinators, civilian contractors who kept the machinery running but never made decisions that altered the course of nations. She reached his checkpoint as a colonel hurried past, talking urgently into his phone. Hastings waved her forward with mechanical efficiency, already glancing toward the next arrival. The woman set her briefcase on the conveyor belt, placed her phone and keys in the plastic tray, and stepped toward the metal detector with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. "Ma'am, I need to see your credentials," Hastings said, his tone carrying that particular blend of courtesy and authority that substituted for actual interest. She reached into her blazer pocket and produced a Pentagon badge, sliding it across the counter. Hastings picked it up, expecting the standard access clearance of a GS-13 or maybe a GS-14 civilian employee. What he saw instead made him pause, his eyes narrowing as he processed the designation: NAVSPECWAR, Naval Special Warfare Command. "This real?" he asked, his skepticism audible. The woman's expression didn't change. No irritation, no indignation, just a patient neutrality that suggested she'd encountered this question before. "Check the system if you'd like." Something in her tone, not quite dismissive but utterly unbothered, triggered Hastings's territorial instinct. The Pentagon saw its share of frauds and wannabes, people who bought official-looking credentials online and tried to bluff their way into America's most secure building. This woman, with her unassuming appearance and complete lack of military bearing, fit that profile better than she fit the profile of someone connected to SEAL operations. "Step aside, ma'am," Hastings said, his voice hardening. "I need to verify this." Behind her, a small queue was forming. A Navy commander shifted his weight impatiently. A civilian analyst checked her watch. The woman simply nodded and moved to the side, setting her briefcase down and folding her hands in front of her with the infinite patience of someone who'd spent years waiting on military bureaucracy. Hastings picked up his desk phone and dialed the verification line, keeping one eye on her as he waited for the connection. She didn't fidget, didn't pull out her phone, didn't show any of the nervous energy that usually accompanied people who were attempting deception. If anything, she looked faintly amused, though her expression remained professionally neutral. "Security verification, Pentagon East Entrance," a bored voice answered on the other end. "Credential number." Hastings read off the alphanumeric sequence from the woman's badge, watching her face for any flicker of concern. Nothing. Just that same patient neutrality, as if she were waiting for a bus rather than facing potential exposure as a fraud. "One moment," the voice said. Hastings heard keyboard clicks, a long pause, more clicking. Then, "What entrance did you say?" "East Entrance, Checkpoint 3." "Hold, please." The line went silent except for the faint hum of distant conversation. Hastings felt a small surge of vindication. Delays usually meant discrepancies, and discrepancies meant his instinct had been correct. He'd probably just prevented a security breach, stopped someone who'd manufactured credentials convincing enough to fool a casual glance but not sophisticated enough to survive system verification. He imagined the commendation that might follow, the recognition from his superiors for his vigilance. The woman caught his eye and offered a slight, knowing smile that made Hastings inexplicably uncomfortable. It wasn't smug or challenging, just the expression of someone who'd seen this movie before and knew exactly how it ended. Behind them, the queue had grown to 7 people. The Navy commander's impatience had evolved into visible irritation. An Army colonel joined the line, coffee in hand, already checking his watch. Still holding, the verification officer came back on the line, his tone subtly different now. Less bored, more careful. Lance Corporal, that badge is authenticated at the highest level. The holder is authorized for unrestricted Pentagon access, including SCIF and command center entry. Is there a problem? Hastings felt heat creep up his neck. No problem, just routine verification. Roger that. The verification officer paused, then added in a lower voice that carried a warning edge. That particular badge belongs to someone you definitely don't want to inconvenience. I'd suggest expediting her entry. The line clicked dead. Hastings slowly lowered the phone, looking at the badge in his hand with new attention. The woman, whoever she was, maintained that same patient expression, neither triumphant nor irritated by the delay. She simply waited, as if she had all the time in the world, as if making a 24-year-old Marine realize his mistake was beneath her concern. "Sorry for the delay, ma'am," Hastings said, sliding the badge back across the counter with mechanical professionalism. "You're cleared for entry." "Thank you, Lance Corporal," she said, her voice carrying no particular inflection. She collected her belongings from the conveyor belt, shouldered her briefcase, and walked toward the interior corridors without looking back. Hastings watched her disappear around the corner, a nagging sense of unease settling in his gut. The Navy commander behind her stepped forward without comment, but Hastings caught the man's expression, something between pity and second-hand embarrassment, the look of someone who just witnessed a junior enlisted Marine significantly miscalculate. The rest of the morning passed in routine fashion, but Hastings couldn't quite shake the encounter. During his lunch break, he found himself thinking about that badge designation NAVSPCWAR and wondering exactly what level of authority it represented. In the Pentagon C-ring, 3 floors above and half a building away, the woman Hastings had delayed walked into a conference room where 16 people stood as she entered. 4 were 3-star admirals. 2 were Marine Corps generals. The rest represented various special operations commands, intelligence agencies, and National Security Council directorates. At the head of the table sat the Secretary of Defense, who nodded in greeting as she took her seat. "Glad you could make it, Vic," the SecDef said. "We've got a situation developing in the Strait of Hormuz that requires your team's immediate attention." Vice Admiral Victoria Reaper Kine opened her briefcase, extracted a tablet, and pulled up the threat assessment with practiced efficiency. 26 years since her first combat deployment. 18 years since she'd commanded her first Special Operations Task Force. 12 years since she'd received her 3rd star and assumed command of Naval Special Warfare Command, the organization responsible for every SEAL team, Special Warfare Combatant Craft Crewman Unit, and Special Reconnaissance Team in the United States Navy. She'd coordinated operations from Afghanistan to Yemen, supervised the training of operators who'd never know her name, and made calls that altered the trajectory of American military engagement across 3 continents. And somewhere below her, a Marine Lance Corporal was probably still wondering if her credentials were legitimate. "What's the timeline?" Kine asked, her attention already absorbed by the satellite imagery on her screen. The next 2 hours passed in the focused intensity of operational planning. Kine's presence in the room was unremarkable to those who knew the architecture of Special Operations Command. She'd held this position long enough that her authority was simply understood. But to the uninitiated, to those who expected special warfare leadership to arrive with obvious markers of rank and theatrical displays of power, her appearance would have registered as disappointingly mundane. She spoke with quiet precision, asked questions that exposed gaps in intelligence assessments, and made decisions with the kind of calm certainty that came from making similar calls 1,000 times before. When the meeting concluded, she gathered her materials and made her way through the Pentagon's labyrinthine corridors toward the parking structure. The building's interior geography was deliberately confusing, designed to disorient visitors and complicate unauthorized movement. Kine navigated it with the automatic ease of long familiarity, her mind already shifting from the Hormuz situation to the evening briefing she'd need to deliver to SEAL Team 7's commander about their upcoming deployment rotation. She was halfway to the parking structure when her phone vibrated. A message from her executive officer. "Heads up, MP at East Entrance apparently gave you grief this morning. He's filed a security concern report. Thought you should know before it hits your desk." Kine paused in the corridor, scrolling through the attached incident report. Lance Corporal Derek Hastings had documented his encounter with what he described as a suspicious civilian claiming NAVSBECWAR credentials, and his subsequent verification protocol. The report was thorough, professionally written, and revealed absolutely zero awareness that he just delayed a 3-star admiral who commanded 8 SEAL teams and over 9,000 personnel. The evening drive back to her quarters at Joint Base Anacostia-Bolling gave Kine time to consider the incident from multiple angles. Part of her appreciated Hastings's diligence. The Pentagon needed security personnel who questioned credentials rather than waving through anyone with confidence. Part of her recognized the broader pattern the encounter represented, the way her gender and unassuming appearance consistently triggered assumptions that had nothing to do with her actual authority. But mostly, she just felt tired of proving herself in small ways that accumulated like grains of sand, tired of the mental calculation required to decide when to correct misconceptions and when to simply let them slide, tired of knowing that tomorrow would bring another version of the same dynamic, played out with different actors in different contexts. Her quarters were technically Admiral's housing, but Kine had stripped them of most military decoration. A few framed photographs from deployments, a shadow box with her medals that she never looked at, and a bookshelf filled with strategic studies and intelligence assessments. She changed into civilian clothes, made herself a simple dinner, and tried to focus on the SEAL Team 7 briefing materials. But her mind kept circling back to that checkpoint encounter, to the Marine's skeptical tone, to the way he'd looked at her badge as if it were a prop rather than proof of 3 decades climbing through the most ruthless meritocracy in the American military. Her phone rang just after 8. The caller ID showed Captain Marcus Webb, her executive officer and a former SEAL Team 6 operator who transitioned to staff work after a training accident had ended his active duty career. Webb had worked with Kine for 4 years and possessed both tactical brilliance and the kind of dark humor that made Pentagon bureaucracy survivable. "Admiral, I'm assuming you saw the incident report," Webb said without preamble. "I did. Want me to make it disappear? One phone call and it never happened." Kine considered this. She could absolutely make the report vanish. She could also have Webb arrange a quiet conversation with Hastings's commanding officer, ensure the Marine understood exactly whose credentials he'd questioned. But neither option addressed the underlying problem, the reflexive skepticism that greeted women in positions of authority, no matter how thoroughly they'd earned those positions. "Leave it," Kine said finally, "but add a note to his personnel file. Not disciplinary, just documenting that he delayed the NAVSBECWAR commander while performing security verification. His co should know." Roger that, Webb paused. For what it's worth, I think you're being generous. Half the flag officers I know would have had his head. He was doing his job, Marcus. Just doing it based on assumptions that didn't match reality. After hanging up, Kine returned to her briefing materials, but her focus had fractured. She found herself thinking about her early career, about the thousand small indignities that had accumulated alongside the larger victories. The flight instructors at Pensacola who'd assumed she was lost when she showed up for training. The carrier air wing commander who'd suggested she might be happier in logistics. The congressional staffer who'd asked if she was someone's assistant when she arrived to brief the Senate Armed Services Committee. Each incident had been small enough to ignore, professional enough to lack obvious malice, and frequent enough to become a background radiation of her career. She'd proven herself in the only arena that ultimately mattered: actual operations. She'd flown 63 combat missions during the invasion of Iraq, coordinating close air support for Marine infantry companies fighting through Fallujah and Ramadi. She'd later commanded a carrier strike group, managed a joint special operations task force in Afghanistan, and spent 3 years at CENTCOM developing the operational architecture for counterterrorism operations across 17 countries. Her third star had come with command of all Naval Special Warfare Forces, a position that put her in charge of the most elite units in the American military. She'd earned every promotion through demonstrated competence in environments where failure meant body bags and international incidents. And still, a checkpoint guard had looked at her credentials and assumed fraud. The next morning, Kine arrived at the Pentagon's river entrance instead of the east checkpoint, a small concession to avoiding unnecessary encounters. Her day began with an intelligence briefing on terrorist networks in the Sahel, continued through operational planning for SEAL Team 3's deployment to the Pacific, and concluded with a video conference with SOCOM leadership about resource allocation for the next fiscal year. Routine activities for someone at her level, the kind of work that shaped American military engagement across the globe while remaining almost entirely invisible to the public. She was reviewing casualty estimates for a potential hostage rescue operation when Webb knocked on her office door, his expression suggesting unwelcome news. Admiral Lance Corporal Hastings requested a meeting, Webb said. He found out whose credentials he verified yesterday. He's pretty shaken up and wants to apologize personally. Kine set down the casualty report, feeling a familiar weariness. Did his co order him to do this? Negative. This is his own initiative. Apparently, he asked around about NAVSPECWAR command structure and had an oh shit moment when he realized who you are. Tell him it's not necessary, Kine said. I tried. He's pretty insistent. Says he can't sleep until he apologizes face to face. Webb's expression held something between amusement and sympathy. Kids young and genuinely mortified. Might actually be good for him to hear directly from you that professional security verification isn't a capital offense. Kine considered this. She had 17 meetings scheduled for the remainder of the day, a deployment authorization that needed her signature, and intelligence reports from 3 different theaters that required her immediate assessment. The last thing she needed was to play counselor to a junior enlisted Marine whose crime had been taking his job seriously. But she also remembered being young in the military, remembered the paralyzing fear that came from realizing you'd made a mistake that couldn't be unmade, remembered the way self-doubt could metastasize if left unaddressed. 20 minutes, she said. Tomorrow at 0900. And Webb makes sure he understands this is a conversation, not a disciplinary meeting. Aye, ma'am. Lance Corporal Derek Hastings arrived at Kine's office suite at 0845, his uniform pressed with extra care, his cover held with white-knuckle intensity. Webb met him in the reception area and offered coffee, which Hastings declined with a voice that suggested his throat had gone completely dry. The executive officer recognized the physical symptoms of extreme stress: shallow breathing, rigid posture, eyes that wouldn't quite focus on any one thing. The kid had probably spent the last 36 hours replaying the checkpoint encounter on loop, imagining career-ending consequences and disciplinary actions that would follow him for the rest of his military service. "Relax, Lance Corporal," Webb said quietly. "The Admiral doesn't bite, she just wants to talk." At precisely 0900, Webb opened the door to Kyne's office and gestured Hastings inside. The space was smaller than Hastings had imagined, filled with tactical maps and operational charts rather than the formal military portraiture he'd expected. Behind a modest desk sat the woman from the checkpoint, now wearing her service dress blues with 3 stars gleaming on each shoulder board. The sight of those stars, the visible proof of authority he'd been too blind to recognize 2 days earlier, nearly buckled Hastings's knees. He snapped to attention with parade ground precision, his salute so crisp it could have cut glass. "Ma'am, Lance Corporal Hastings reporting as ordered." Kyne returned the salute and gestured to the chair across from her desk. "At ease, Lance Corporal. Have a seat." Hastings sat, his posture remaining rigid despite the instruction to relax. Kyne studied him for a moment. Young, probably not yet 25, with the kind of earnest intensity that made good Marines but also led to sleepless nights when mistakes revealed themselves. She'd commanded enough young service members to recognize genuine remorse versus performative apology, and this kid was radiating authentic distress. "I understand you wanted to speak with me," Kyne said, her tone neutral. "Yes, ma'am." Hastings swallowed hard. "I wanted to apologize for my conduct at the checkpoint. I should have processed your credentials without delay. I should have recognized your authority. I showed a lack of professionalism that reflects poorly on my unit and the Marine Corps. I take full responsibility for my actions and accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate." The words came out rehearsed, probably practiced in front of a mirror for hours. Kyne let the silence stretch for a moment, watching Hastings's discomfort grow. She wasn't being cruel, just creating space for whatever he actually needed to say beyond the formal apology. "Lance Corporal, you verified suspicious credentials according to established protocol," Kyne said finally. "That's your job. You didn't violate any regulations or fail to follow proper procedure. So what exactly are you apologizing for?" Hastings's careful composure cracked slightly. "Ma'am, I questioned your credentials because I assumed someone who looked like you couldn't possibly hold the position that badge indicated. I profiled you based on appearance rather than evidence. That's not professionalism. That's prejudice."